Okay, so we're back in our code editor, and I'm located in lecture 30 folder, which is located in full stack course 5/examples folder. And this is again our shopping list directive app. And the goal of our task right now is to provide a button next to each list item and let the user click it and it will get removed. Except we're going to try to accomplish this task in a little bit of a wrong way first. And what we're going to do is we're going to supply this bed remove attribute on our shopping list directive, and we're going to pass the actual function directly as a reference to our directive. If we go to app.js, we'll see here that on our directive itself, we're going to create a bed remove property, and we're going to use an equal sign. So it will be a bidirectional binding, and the function value of that remove that we're going to pass in is going to be equal to this bed remove property. In the actual service remove method, or controller I should say, in the actual controller remove method, we're going to have one more thing. Let me actually close the file browser so it'll be easier to see. But what we're going to do is we're going to have one more side effect here that I'll uncomment, and we're going to create a property under this keyword, which means, since we're using control S syntax, is going to be attached to the controller's instance. And it's going to be called last removed. Basically, whenever somebody passes us an item index, we're going to look that item index up in our this.items array and save the name of that item in the last removed property. In the index.html, we're going to place a real quick span here, and we'll say last, or list, I should say, dot last removed. So now we're going to output whatever it is that was last removed right inside of our controller. This list is the label for our shopping list controller. If we go to the shopping list.html, which is the template for our directive, we're going to see here a button, and the button says list.bedRemove. And bedRemove is our function, and we're able to obviously take a function reference, which is what this is, surrounded with parens, and execute it, passing it our $ index, which is the index in the list that somebody is clicking to remove, and the button name is going to be bed remove. Just to look back at index.html, we have our bed remove attribute mapped to list.removeItem. So it's the remove item function value that is being assigned to this bed remove, and then that bed remove gets called right here inside of our directive template. Okay, so let's save that, and let's go to the browser, and let's try to add item test1. We'll just say test for now. We'll click that item. We'll see the bed remove button. Test2, click add item button. Test3, and click the add item button. One more thing let's go take a look at when we go to the code is that I printed out this console.log this is, and I'm printing out what the this variable is pointing to. Just important, so we'll be able to look at the console and see when we attach the this.lastRemove and this.title, where's this actually pointing to at the time that we call it. Let's go back to our browser, and let's go ahead and actually open the console so we could see what's going on. Open the console here, and let's go ahead and try to click bed remove item number 1. When we click here, we see that for some reason we don't have any kind of announcement here what the last removed item was. And if we take a look at our console, I think it's going to give us a clue. This is, and remember, this right now is being called from the remove item method that is sitting on our controller, that is the main controller. And if we take a look, this is shopping list directive controller. So it's not the shopping list controller, it's shopping list directive controller, which is not what we want, because shopping list directive controller is the controller for our isolate scope, and we wanted this to execute in the parent controller scope. As you can see, all these things that we thought were being assigned on the parent controller scope are actually being assigned directly to our directives isolate scope. And that's why you see that the title still says the list number 1 has 3 items in it. And so what happened to the title? Well, when we said this.title and updated the title with 2 items, it went ahead and created .title, the title property, on our shopping list directive controller. Meanwhile, the actual shopping list controller doesn't know anything about this. Let's go back to the code editor and actually take a look as to why something like that is happening. I actually created this.html, and it's just referencing this.js, so we'll be able to see what's going on. Here's a quick example on a microcosm as to what's going on here in our controllers. Suppose we have this function called person, and it says this.full name is Yakov, this.fav is cookies. And we have one method on this object, which is the function, and all it's doing is logging to the console and says this.full name likes this.fav. If we now go ahead and create this Yakov object with the call to new person, as we should, that this variable inside of this object will be pointing to the person object. And when we call Yakov.describe, in other words, this method, this will still be pointing to the person object, and therefore you'll be able to reference full name and fav. So let's go ahead and actually comment this out for a second. Let's go ahead and save that, and let's open this.html in the browser. And you'll see that the console says Yakov likes cookies. Very true. Now, if we go back and go to this.js, what we're going to do now is we're going to pull out the method from this Yakov object. After all, Yakov.describe without the parens is just a function value. So we could grab that value and stick it in a local variable. And then, since that local variable is pointing to a function value, we could actually execute it just by putting parens behind it. If we save that and go back to our browser, let's refresh that. You can see here already says that undefined likes undefined. How come this is going on? Well, the reason this is going on is if we actually put a console.log right inside of here, let's put a log statement here and say what exactly is this variable. Let's go ahead and say this is, what is this variable? Let's go ahead and output this. You could see that the first time we go around, this variable is the person. But the second time going around, this variable is actually the window. And the window doesn't have a full name and a fav. The reason this is happening is because we took that method out of its context, and its context became the window, because we were sitting, after all, in a global scope. There is actually a JavaScript solution to that, and it's called the call method. If you take the method that is out of context, in other words, the this variable is pointing to whatever the surrounding context is, you could actually give it context, and basically it will get that this variable assigned to whatever object that you're passing in the call method. So if we invoke describe with the call method and pass it the object Yakov, that this variable will all of a sudden once again be pointing to Yakov. So if we save that and go back to our browser, you'll see that even though the first time it says undefined, undefined, the next time this is actually pointing back into person, and it actually will say Yakov likes cookies. And this is what's happening in our controller. If we go back, we could close this now. What's happening in our controllers is that when this call is being made right here, this call is being made just with a function reference. It's like a variable that was yanked out of its context and now sitting in a different context. In the case of the describe function in our this example, it was sitting in the context of the window object. Well, in the case of this bad remove example, it's sitting in the context of the directives controller, not of the parent controller as we want it. So the solution is to use the at reference and then pass a map of arguments that is mapped to how we call this method to begin with. So let's go to app.js, and what we're going to do now is we're going to declare yet another attribute, and another attribute is going to be called onRemove, and onRemove is going to have an ampersand binding, which means it's going to be a reference binding. We'll go to index.html, and we'll add one more button right here, or one more attribute, and we'll call it onRemove, and this time we'll call list.remove item, and we'll pass it an index. Except, as I told you, as you remember, this index is not something that the shopping list controller will be passing. This index is just a key for our directive to be able to find and assign some value to it. So all of this will get executed in the context of the shopping list controller, not of the shopping list directive controller. Let's go ahead and actually put this back there. It'll look a little bit better that way. We'll go back to our shopping list.html, that is the template for our directive. Let's close the file browser so it'll be easy to see. and we'll actually uncomment this button right here. And if you take a look, it's list, which is the list of my shopping list directive controller. OnRemove, that's the property we mapped OnRemoved into the controller on our isolate scope. And then you could see we're passing it an object that is a map. It's mapping the index. If you take a look at the index.html, this is the index that we're mapping. So it's taking that index and it's saying it should be equal to, at the time that you call this, it should be equal to $index, which is the index through the loop at the moment. Now when we save it and go back to the browser, we'll close this example and we'll close this as well. And here's our directive with isolate scope. Let's go ahead and add test. Well, first of all, it's not refreshing for some reason. Let's refresh it. Here we go. Okay, so let's add our test 1. Add 1, so we have bed remove and remove item. We'll do test 2. Add that item. And test 3. And add that item. And let's go ahead and try to click remove item. Let's say remove test 2. If we click remove test 2, you'll see that the last item removed showed up here, which means that property did show up in the parent controller. And if we take a look in our remove item method, we logged what the variable this pointed to. In this case, it's pointing to the shopping list controller, which is exactly what we wanted. We wanted to execute that method in the context of the shopping list controller, which is the parent of our directive. And if you take a look, all the things that we need are here, and you see the last remove property is here, and the shopping list title also got updated to 2, and therefore it's right there. If we remove it again, this time we remove number 1, so it's number 1, and so on. So this is working. So once again, what allowed us to be able to call this method in the context of the parent of this directive is the reference that we declared onRemove property with, which is the ampersand that is giving us a reference to the function such that it's going to get executed in its parent environment, evaluating all the properties like they should be. Okay, so let's summarize. The ampersand binding allows us to execute an expression, such as a function value, in the context of the parent scope. The way this is done is the following. The parent template must declare an attribute providing the method reference for the directive to call on the parent, and an argument keys for directive to bind values to when it needs to pass the data from the isolate scope back to the parent scope. The directive, on the other hand, calls the reference method and also provides an object map of argument key to value pairs. This allows the directive to pass data back to the parent from the isolate scope.